Hello, everyone. I want to welcome you to today's program. My name is Linda Maisels, and I'm the Managing Director of the Yale Program for the Study of Anti-Semitism, or as we say, YPSA. Today, I'm pleased to welcome Claire Aubin, who will be speaking on the subject, Imagining Evil, Immigrant Holocaust Perpetrators in American Media. Her talk is based on her research for an upcoming article that will be published in a special issue of the journal Holocaust Studies. That issue will be devoted to the subject of non-German Holocaust perpetration or collaboration and memory. I want to remind you that, as always, we will have time for questions at the end of Claire's talk. We have disabled the chat function, so please, if you have a question, submit it under the Q&A function. And now, I'd like to get to the main event, but first, a brief introduction. Claire Aubin is currently a postdoctoral associate at the Yale Program for the Study of Anti-Semitism, and we're thrilled to have her. She has a PhD and an LLM, or Master of Laws, from the University of Edinburgh, and her doctoral dissertation is the basis for a forthcoming monograph with Cambridge University Press. It's titled The Homeland: Nazi Perpetrators as Immigrants to America. You should also note that Claire is the host of the popular general history podcast, This Guy Sucked, which we recommend that you all tune in and enjoy. Claire, I think you're out there. Great to see you. We're also thrilled to have the opportunity to hear more about your research. Please take it away.
Thank you so much. Sorry for not immediately coming on the screen. Thank you so much for that, Linda, and thank you to YPSA for a really wonderful first semester and a half at Yale. And thank you all out there in the audience for being here to listen to me. I want to start by saying something that maybe sounds controversial on the face of it, but we'll get into because I don't think it's actually that controversial of a statement, actually. Which is that America loves to fantasize about the Holocaust. The Holocaust, or its various constitutive parts, trends on American social media more days than it does not. We fantasize about heroism, about liberation, about Holocaust memory and our roles as the protectors of that memory, about rescue and about redemption and punishment and revenge. We make films, we write think pieces, we break ground on new memorials all the time. We sell merchandise, we buy tickets to visit Auschwitz and Theresienstadt in the summer. We fantasize about how to avoid another event like the Holocaust, of course, without ever looking backwards or forwards or inwards at periods of time that are similar in consequence, if not directly analogous in format. And since nearly the moment of its ending, we have fantasized about the Holocaust's perpetrators. When it comes to them, we are a nation of intrepid reporters and mind readers and private detectives who are sort of haunted by the specter of the Holocaust, a specter who has fled its European birth and really made a home on American soil and lurks in our imagination behind every wall and on every side street, or at least that's how we imagine it. The very real fugitive Holocaust perpetrator in America looks very different from his fantastical counterpart, who lives mostly in our minds, our newspapers, our books, and our films. Through appearances in film, television, and literature, the so-called Nazis next door have been very neatly embedded into what I would say are sort of grand post-war narratives of American Holocaust memory and mythologies of a sort of ever-present genocidal evil. So today I'm kind of offering you a state of the field, a state of the union, kind of fittingly, on how this phenomenon has been addressed within various forms of American storytelling, beginning with the Nazis who live in our imagination. So I'm going to begin the talk part of the talk with the vignette, drawn from a moment 2 years ago when I went to see a film that turned out to be about a secret Nazi, which happens to me far more frequently than you might expect. In it, the immigrant Nazi was an easy, even kind of lazy placeholder for evil, as they very frequently are. But I want to think about how this happened. If you're the writer of the newest Indiana Jones movie, for example, and the last one didn't do so great because it ended up being about aliens for some reason, how do you make the villains as compelling as they were several decades ago? You make them Nazis again. There's not really an emotional buy-in that you need to ensure. there's not really a real backstory that you need to tell. And at the time that this was put out, so 2 years ago, there was no danger that this was going to create a political issue to make someone a Nazi and a bad guy in a film. I don't know if that's as true now, which is pretty disheartening. Everybody who likes Indiana Jones probably hates Nazis, just given the sort of nature of the original Indiana Jones films and the franchise in general. But the first half of this film, The Dial of Destiny, is set in America. So to solve this problem, you just make the bad guy a Nazi who has been secretly hiding out in America and influencing American science and politics in order to, I think what the film says is go back in time and kill Hitler so that Germany would have won the war. It doesn't have to make sense, actually. They just have to be the evilest person imaginable. And in this way, the image of the immigrant perpetrator as a sort of dastardly interloper in an America that's otherwise worthy of admiration in the post-war period is reified. Plenty of writing has been produced on the Holocaust perpetrator as an archetypal literary character or filmic trope, and examinations of these characterizations are usually limited to their perceived contributions to their respective media formats. So we think about what the Nazi means in film, what the Nazi means in the literary world, but I'm curious about what these imagined Nazis mean for history. These tropes have very real consequences when they take root in the minds of the public outside of the context of fictional cinematic or literary representations. I think this is doubly true in relation to immigrant perpetrators in America, misunderstandings about which are really fueled by the fact that the general American public has a very poor knowledge of the Holocaust by any standard of measurement. Uh, the American public's understanding of the Holocaust is so poor, in fact, that one 2018 study found that over one-third of American adults do not know that the Holocaust was the extermination of Jewish people, and nearly two-thirds do not know that it occurred anywhere other than Germany. The fact that its perpetrators and their post-war trajectories are not well understood is, I think, not surprising in light of that information. The real lives of immigrant perpetrators present challenges to both American misunderstandings of the Holocaust and deeply held beliefs about American society and justice in the post-war period. Instead of reconciling these fallacies with sort of factual or reconciling these fallacies with factual reality, a much more narratively convenient immigrant perpetrator has been crafted by American media, both fictional, literary, filmic, but also in terms of journalistic media. In order to understand this phenomenon, I think it's important to first introduce two very different people. One is real, the other is not. One, the imagined perpetrator in America, exists primarily in national fantasies. The other, the real immigrant perpetrator, lived or lives in our world. And I'm going to take you through these two versions of what is allegedly the same person. So, who's the imagined Nazi? Of course, here I'm saying Nazi and not the more general Holocaust perpetrator, because in the American imagination, the Venn diagram of these two people is a circle rather than leaving any sort of room for complexity, which, a lot of my work is about this complexity. The imagined media Nazi is German, for example. There is almost never discussion or indeed even mention of perpetrators belonging to any ethnicity or nationality other than German. Within these fictional expressions of American post-Holocaust memory, the act of perpetration is cast as a solely German phenomenon at both the macro and micro scale, which reinscribes popular American narratives that ignore local complicity in the commission of the Holocaust. And if he is a German man, unless he's a sort of sexy, or she, I suppose, is a sexy femme fatale woman, which is its own sort of fetishistic genre of film and literature. If he's a German man, he is preferably one with little glasses like Eichmann, or a really strong jaw like Goering, or even a sort of washed out, colorless, blonde haired, blue eyed Aryan thing going on. But he still somehow always has the aura of a like squirrely mustache twirling deviant. In Stephen King's novella Apt Pupil, an elderly former camp commandant in Los Angeles named Carl Dusander is described as bald, wrinkled, and pouched and puffy, but with faded blue eyes. And Dusander reminds his young protege, before his hair turned white and fell out, it was blonde. What King is doing here is reminding us that despite Dessander's age and the relative unimportance of his previous appearance to the story itself, it's imperative that the audience knows that he once conformed to an ethnic standard traditionally associated with his status as a Nazi. This tendency within fiction evokes physiognomic interpretations of Nazism, interpretations which were, in many cases, encouraged into existence by adherents to Nazism in the first place. So, what does the imagined Nazi in America do? He's almost always successful in some way, and that success is always facilitated by his Nazi past. Either the CIA gave him a job, or he's a high level politician or a business person with ties to the Nazi party. He's rarely just the sort of guy next door with a dark secret. When the imagined perpetrator is discovered, it's often because he's part of some plot to overthrow the government or to kill again. And it's usually because he's being tracked by a group of agents or that he's in public and comes across very dramatically one of his former victims in the camps who dedicates their life to pursuing him and getting justice. And here I say camp victims because the imagined perpetrator almost always is tied to a concentration camp, probably because these are the most sort of visually iconic representations of the Holocaust. So, for instance, in Marathon Man, Dr. Kristen Schell, who's played in its filmic adaptation by Laurence Olivier, is implicated in experimentation and torture at Auschwitz, while in the comedy film Getting Away with Murder, Jack Lemmon plays a former commandant at the fictional Bear Cow. In the even more fictitious world of X-Men First Class, Kevin Bacon plays an eternally youthful mutant and former concentration camp guard, where he experimented on young Jewish mutants somewhere in Poland before fleeing to America to become a supervillain. So not only are the vast majority of imagined Nazis in America restricted to being German, they're also restricted to a very specific set of potential relationships to the Holocaust itself. And how do we respond to him when we find him in our imaginations? When he's discovered, we usually kill him. And we usually do it in a way that is sufficiently heinous so as to feel like a sort of measure of revenge or a poetic justice. For instance, in the TV show Hunters, a former Nazi chemist named Hanna von Staub living in Cape Canaveral, Florida, is gassed in her shower as a sort of poetic, fitting revenge for her role in the use of chemicals against Holocaust victims. In the movie The Secrets We Keep, a former SS member named Carl is shot. This is two Carls, which I think is interesting. They keep being named Carl. A former SS member named Carl is shot in front of a pit and buried there after being tortured for literally half of the film as a sort of symbolic callback to Nazi death pits. In Apt Pupil, the book that I mentioned earlier by Stephen King, which is also a 1998 film starring Ian McKellen, the elderly Carl Dessander is discovered and blackmailed by a very strange Holocaust-obsessed teenager who forces him to wear a replica SS uniform and march around his house. Eventually, Carl has a heart attack, and while in the hospital, he is recognized by a survivor of the camp that he oversaw, whereupon he commits suicide to avoid being taken to Israel and standing trial. Dusander's final few moments of consciousness are spent terrorized by the idea that he might experience death as a never-ending nightmare, wherein, quote, wave after wave of scrawny, naked prisoners break through a camp fence to pursue him. This is also treated by the book and the film as a fitting end for him. These acts of retribution against a fictional perpetrator are almost always extrajudicial, only rather than being framed as less just because of their separation from a judicial system, they're framed as being more just because they have a sort of interpersonal directness to them. And this is what I mean when I say that all of this is part of a larger fantasy. The immigrant Nazi in TV and film is not real, nor are his consequences. He exists only as an outlet for hatred or for vengeance, not for historical understanding. He is almost never granted real nuance in the way that he might be if his imagined self had stayed in Europe. The immigrant Nazi is particularly evil because he escaped that European context and is infecting America and has to be punished for that crime as well, almost always with a protracted and painful death. The way that we present, discover, and respond to the imagined Nazi bears very little resemblance to the way that real immigrant Holocaust perpetrators appeared, were discovered, and were dealt with in America. In many ways, these fictionalized narratives seem mostly to reflect what we wish perpetrators looked and acted like, because these perpetrators present easy answers to the questions that we ask of them. Like, are they evil? Well, yes, very straightforwardly. Will they ever get justice if we don't directly subject them to it? Well, no. So the answer is to hunt them down and murder them for revenge. Will doing that make us feel better? Yes, according to these books and films, definitely yes. In this way, the imagined perpetrator exists as part of a larger American fantasy, one which allows Americans to continuously amend and recast our collective role both during the Holocaust and in the search for justice after it. The real immigrant perpetrator in America and his real context and real circumstances present a much less clear-cut path for us. So we often abandon him in favor of the version of him that we imagine and seemingly prefer, simply because that version is much easier for us to cope with. So, who is the real immigrant Holocaust perpetrator in America? In some ways, that's difficult to say because the actual immigrant Nazi in America does not fit very neatly into a singular box the way that the imagined one does. As part of a massive wave of post war immigration, thousands of perpetrators began new lives abroad. An unknown number, I think certainly fewer than Alan Ryan's famous estimate of 10,000, settled in the United States. Hundreds of men and women with alleged ties to Nazism have been investigated by Nazi hunting groups like the US Department of Justice's Office of Special Investigations, or OSI, with around 150 facing credible public accusation and or prosecution. Those are the ones that I look at. On the whole, the lives of these perpetrators lack the intrigues of their imagined counterparts and do not lend themselves to outlandish dramatization without very significant sort of alteration. For starters, the real Nazi in America might not even be a Nazi. He very frequently was not actually ever a Nazi Party member, which is for many the key determining factor in whether or not someone can really be called a Nazi in like an official capacity. And he was far more likely to have been a member of a wartime collaborationist regime. The real perpetrator in America is also rarely German. In fact, less than 10% of accused immigrant perpetrators were both ethnically German and German by nationality, and another 38% fall into the Volksdeutsche gray zone, so ethnically German but belonging to another nationality and living to the east of the Reich, most commonly Romania and the Balkan states. In total, less than half were German by the Nazis' own standards. In fact, based on my research, the real known immigrant perpetrator is most frequently from one of two countries, Lithuania or Ukraine, both areas with extremely high incidences of native collaboration and perpetration. The prevalence of Eastern European Holocaust collaboration and perpetration is almost never addressed in these fictionalized imaginings of immigrant perpetrators, which in turn only really underscores broad American misunderstandings of who actually participated in the commission of the Holocaust. This also means that any media coverage of the real immigrant perpetrator must also include explanations of the Holocaust in Eastern Europe, which America already isn't particularly interested in, making the real perpetrator an even more difficult subject to work with and understand. If the imagined one has a very clear archetypal image, what does the real immigrant perpetrator look like? So firstly, I'm going to continue calling him a he because the vast majority, around 90%, or sorry, 99% of accused Holocaust perpetrators in America have been men, with only a couple of female outliers. I'm certain that it's not going to surprise you to know that the real immigrant perpetrator is not the perfect example of Aryan manhood. In fact, he's not really anything in particular looks-wise, because the real immigrant perpetrator in America varies wildly in age, in stature, in hair color and eye color and physical ability, because he's not an archetype of a person, he's a real person. And what does the real one do? Well, there's a very small handful of them who end up working for the US government or for intelligence organizations like their fictional counterparts, but these are also truly outliers. Only around 4% of the men who have been publicly accused or prosecuted for Holocaust perpetration worked for any period of time as US intelligence assets, most frequently for the CIA. However, while some known Holocaust perpetrators did enter with the assistance of the US government, the majority completed relatively commonplace immigration processes. Unlike the political intrigue or business success, which characterized the lives of the imagined immigrant Nazis of film and television, perpetrators in America largely led post-immigration lives that are basically unremarkable. Instead, they commonly spent their post-war lives as working class laborers, so skilled, trade, or otherwise, often in the large factories of the post-war industrialized Northeastern and Midwestern United States. They have children who join the 4-H club, wives who attend church. They collect Social Security when they retire, and their lives are, for the most part, pretty nondescript. The imagined perpetrator usually takes on an assumed name and finds his way to the US via a sort of clandestine scheme or a rat line, which is actually how many perpetrators went to South America. But in reality, immigrant perpetrators in America usually lived in displaced persons camps after the war, just like everybody else. They applied to immigrate like everybody else and basically just lied on their immigration applications when they were asked what they'd been up to during the war. They generally immigrated under their real names or an anglicized version of their real names, owing in large part to the fact that they were mostly not German and not Nazi Party affiliated, and were aware that it was not likely that the US had access to records relating to their participation in the Holocaust. Over and over in these stories, it seems clear taking on a sort of elaborate assumed identity, the way that we imagine they did, was far less useful and far more work than just cultivating a relatively convincing poker face. Even more interestingly, in contrast with the fictional Nazi next door, is the context under which the real immigrant perpetrator actually participated in the violence of the Holocaust, which is to say, usually as a low-level functionary with very little actual decision-making power. There are a small number of immigrant perpetrators in America who actually held power within the very rigid hierarchies of the camps and general Nazi machinery. But again, they represent less than 5% of the group as a whole. Immigrant Nazis in America were, for the most part, both before and after immigrating, very ordinary, which in itself still remains one of the aspects of the Holocaust that America really, really struggles with. As part of our collective Holocaust fantasy, every Holocaust perpetrator was powerful and bloodthirsty and enjoyed his job, even did it for fun. And then once he was finished with his job, it kind of becomes the invisible axis around which the entire rest of his life rotated. The imagined perpetrator's life stops at the moment of perpetration and is forever frozen at that point. It's not as though he has a life before perpetration and a life after it, but instead he has a life in which Holocaust perpetration is its primary organizing event because it was the event that defined the imagined perpetrator's entire reason for being included in the story in the first place. Remember, he's just an avatar for evil. But when it comes to historical reality, I would argue instead that the experience of perpetration was not the primary concern of a real immigrant perpetrator, but instead acted as a foundation upon which his real life was built. His life relied on it insofar as he had to lie about it repeatedly forever, and particularly in interactions with government mechanisms. But he certainly did not need to entirely shape his world to its contours, as stories about his imagined counterparts would lead you to believe. Well, once we find him, how do we actually respond to him if we don't just kill him like they do in the movies? I think this question, which I do get asked pretty frequently, I think this is probably the area in which we see the most direct contrast between the imagined perpetrator in America and the real one. The fictional Nazi's story, as I mentioned, ends satisfyingly and gruesomely with vengeance and this sort of ability to move on with our lives, knowing that his is forfeit and he's died in this sort of painful, horrible way. The real perpetrator's life almost never ends this way. Not only is vigilante justice exceedingly rare as a general rule, but it's also rarely effective in achieving its goals. 3 perpetrators had their houses bombed, allegedly by radical Jewish vigilante groups, with only one actually causing life-threatening injuries to the perpetrator himself. In the cases of the other 2 bombs, one was inadvertently triggered by a neighbor who was injured very severely and ended up needing a leg amputated. Um, and the other was at the wrong address entirely. In fact, the real death of a perpetrator, and most but not all have died by now, the real death of a perpetrator is truly more of a whimper than a bang. Over half have died of natural causes in America in the same towns in which they settled and made their lives. The average age at death for a perpetrator is 83, which is a far cry from the sort of strapping young or even middle-aged Nazis of film and literature that victims are able to take their revenge on. But if their consequences are not extrajudicial, then surely they've got to face some serious legal consequences, right? I have a photo of someone in court right here. No, also that doesn't really happen. For those who faced prosecution at the hands of the government, it was not for genocide because we don't have laws that allow us to prosecute people for genocides that didn't occur on American soil. And because, in the eyes of American law, the real crime they committed in coming here was not murder, it was immigration fraud through lying about murder. In the cases where the government has succeeded in mounting a prosecution for this immigration fraud, only 80 perpetrators, which is a little over half, even lost their citizenship. Fully a quarter faced no legal consequences whatsoever. And the only perpetrators who have died in direct relation to the cases against them have been that one bombing, two suicides, and one as a result of being sent back to the Soviet Union where he was executed. In truth, the primary consequences faced by actual accused immigrant perpetrators are reputational, not carceral and not punitive in nature. Further underscoring this, in an interview, Office of Special Investigations Deputy Director Eli Rosenbaum told a reporter that their, quote, biggest accomplishment is probably changing the perception of what we might call the community of Nazi criminals who have found refuge here. By the government's own admission, in most cases, it appears that the worst punishment the American government is usually willing to dole out to a Holocaust perpetrator is public knowledge of their crimes. The character of the Nazi in America does not only live in the world of fiction. In fact, one of the most frequent indulgers of this trope and shapers of this imagined character is the American and occasionally foreign press, who have also gotten this singular sensationalized image of perpetrators and perpetration between their teeth. For instance, one LA Times article describes the 2005 meeting between federal prosecutors and accused perpetrator Josias Kumpf. The reporter writes that Kumpf jokingly offered a Sieg Heil when he was accused, then describes the way in which Kumpf was coerced into SS service before transitioning to spending the majority of the article describing things that generally occurred at Travniki, which is the camp that Kumpf worked at, in extreme, gruesome detail. Kumpf is kind of lost in the story otherwise. This is a trend that can be observed throughout journalistic approaches to immigrant perpetrators in America. Telling a very captivating story matters as much as telling a true one. I often call this jokingly, but also quite seriously, the true crimification of Holocaust perpetration, where a perpetrator is treated like a vehicle to discuss the atrocities of the Holocaust in the same way that podcasters, a thing I am guilty of being, in the same way that podcasters talk about like serial killers or solve whodunits. In these scenarios, the context of perpetration of the Holocaust more generally is condensed to its simplest form, murderer versus victim, as are the complex relationships that perpetrators have to both their victims and to the fact of their own perpetration. They are, like their fictionalized versions, reduced to a concentrated, instrumentalized version of evil that has to be stopped. But what is truly strange about these journalistic depictions is that they regularly take the US government at its word when it comes to these perpetrators. In the majority of cases where a perpetrator has faced prosecution at the hands of the American government, the government has then gone on to put out press releases that border on self-aggrandizement or at least represent significant back padding for a job well done. This is the case even where the job is only half done. For instance, following the 2018 deportation of Ukrainian perpetrator Yakuv Pali to Germany, the Department of Justice announced in a press release that his removal sent, quote, yet another message of deterrence to anyone who would dare even contemplate participating in human rights crimes. And that, quote, the passage of time would never weaken our government's resolve to pursue justice on behalf of the victims. However, at the time of Pali's deportation, it was already known that the 95-year-old would not be prosecuted in Germany. Basically, his return to Europe, to the European sort of continent, was at most a symbolic gesture. After these press releases come out, they are quoted relentlessly by journalists as evidence that the US has in fact done what it claims to have done and brought perpetrators to justice. But again, only half of the perpetrators who are prosecuted by the US have even lost their citizenship, and an even smaller number have left the country, most of whom have actually done so voluntarily. The issue then seems to be that when it comes to Nazis next door, reality simply can't be allowed to get in the way of the imagined. The role of Holocaust memory and fantasy within American culture require that we come out on top as heroes who have rooted out villains and brought them to justice after decades of hiding among us, even though that justice very often amounts to what I would call little more than a very expensive and time-consuming public shaming. Rather than rejecting this premise, the American press has, in most cases, bolstered it. And this is particularly bizarre because Jewish organizations have repeatedly stated that they feel this is not justice. And they're regularly quoted saying as much in these same articles and broadcasts that proclaim it to be sufficient justice. But the Jewish organization's statements are framed as being biased in ways that the US government's own self-representation is not. And none of this is to say that the multitude of ways that journalists have covered real immigrant perpetrators have been exclusively bad, only that they are overwhelmingly uncritical. That is perhaps the imagined Nazi and his American consequences are simply too deeply rooted because of the satisfaction that they offer us. So much so that when a real one is encountered, we really struggle to avoid forcing his story to fit into the box that we have constructed for his fictional counterpart. This journalistic tendency towards sensational stories extends also to the types of real immigrant perpetrators whose stories are told in the first place. The repeated blurring of the lines between fantasy and reality when it comes to Holocaust perpetrators in America has also led to an unfortunate trend within nonfiction literature and press coverage. The repeated highlighting of a small handful of people whose stories most resemble the lives that we imagine them leading. So, because everyone loves case studies, in the interest of providing some case studies for you to think about, I'm going to quickly go over three of what I call preferred perpetrators. So, people whose lives, real people whose real lives, conveniently reflect the fictionalized lives that we most frequently imagine. So, these are people who have real stories that fit into this box. Okay, the first one I want to talk about is Cherem or Tom Sobzokov. So he's Russian, Circassian, like ethnically. Um, he is a Waffen SS member, part of the North Caucasian Legion. He resettles in Paterson, New Jersey. His crime within the context of being in the SS was that he participated in rounding up Jews and communists as part of Nazi punitive detachments. While he's in America, he's briefly a CIA anti-Soviet operative. He's a local politician and a Democratic employee. So, he's like implicated in the government and he's hiding out and doing sneaky government stuff. He doesn't experience any legal consequences. And the reason for that, he has his immigration fraud claim dropped. The reason for that is partially because it's revealed that he did actually tell immigration authorities he'd been a Waffen SS member. So he did actually know. And then he dies in one of these vigilante attacks through a pipe bomb on his house. And he has this very long, like month-long suffering. And all of this fits with what we imagine was happening to perpetrators when they came to the US. And so like he has a sort of movie style story. Another one is Hubertus Struchold, who is German. He's a medical scientist. He oversaw medical experimentation at Dachau. He resettles in Texas. He also works for the government as a scientist and at NASA. He's known as the father of space medicine. So this, again, fits with the idea that they're like scientists and they do all these dastardly things and they hide that way. He also experiences no legal consequences and dies of natural causes at age 88. The last preferred perpetrator I want to talk about is Mykola Lebed, also known as Roman Turan. He is Ukrainian. He was an OUNB leader. He led massacres of Poles and Jews in Volhynia. He resettles in New York City. He also is a CIA operative. He led the anti-Soviet Prologue Research Center. He has no legal consequences, and he dies of natural causes at age 89. There are a couple others like John Demjanjuk and Werner von Braun who also show up time after time in hyper-sensationalized nonfiction monographs. I say nonfiction, maybe in quotes. These monographs straddle, I think, the line between fiction and nonfiction a little bit in terms of how sensationalized they are. Um, the lives who are led by these chosen few whose stories fit with what we imagine their stories are certainly very interesting and thought-provoking, but they don't actually reflect the lives that are led by the overwhelming majority of accused immigrant perpetrators. These are just 3 to 5 of them in a group of 150. In reality, these lives were much less convenient and they looked more like this. I'm going to talk to you about 3 case studies of inconvenient perpetrators. So people whose stories kind of stymie this broader narrative and as a result are not made famous in the same way. So there's Georg or George Lindert, who is Romanian. He's a Volksdeutsche, so he's an ethnic German from Romania. He was a camp guard at Mauthausen and Leubel Pass. He moved to Canfield, Ohio, becomes a factory worker. He has no legal consequences, doesn't do anything of much note. He's not related to the government. We have no reason to believe he lives a particularly evil life in America or something. And he dies of natural causes at age 84. Another one is Michael Karkuch, who is a Ukrainian born in what's now Poland. He was a commander of the Ukrainian Legion of Self-Defense. He resettled in Minneapolis. He was a carpenter. Again, didn't do anything of much note in the US. He has no legal consequences, and he dies of natural causes at the age of 100. Also, interestingly, I always think about this. Part of the defense that was offered about him when he is caught and accused is his son goes to the papers and says he could not have been a Nazi. He was a Republican. Um, and I think about that a lot. Like the narrative has shifted a lot in terms of how we think of relationships between groups. Um, and then the last one I want to talk about is Reinhold Kula, who is a Volksdeutscher man. So again, this ethnic German, and born in Poland. He was a camp guard at Gross Rosen and resettled just outside of Chicago, Illinois. He was a high school custodian, and he's deported to Germany in 1987, and that's it. These 3 stories are not that interesting. And I don't mean that in a bad way, which I'll get to in just a second, but they don't have this sort of dynamism that we're expecting out of Holocaust perpetrators in America. But their stories are much closer to pretty much everyone else who did this and lived here. I suspect that there is a fairly simple reason that we choose not to acknowledge lives like these, which make up the overwhelming majority of immigrant perpetrator cases in the US. And that's because they're boring. And that mundanity, despite being real, does not allow us space for things like revenge fantasies. And it doesn't allow Americans to be or become heroes of Holocaust memory. And it doesn't make perpetrators look particularly and specifically evil. And it doesn't make us feel better about the post-Holocaust world. In essence, I think these stories do not reassure us of our place in the post-Holocaust world or confirm our suspicions about evil as an intrinsic state of being rather than a set of choices. They don't resemble the mythic archetypes that I've described, and instead they kind of remind us that the Holocaust was in large part operated by relatively boring people who led relatively normal lives afterwards. In many ways, this mundanity is what makes them worth learning about and writing about, regardless of whether it sells the most books or papers or movie tickets. They matter not in spite of their boringness, but because of that. Because the boringness reveals the ease with which most perpetrators were able to set down their pre-immigration lives and pick up their new American identities, although their worlds were sort of predicated on a lie or a series of lies to immigration officials. Once they entered American life, they were able to build a new self that was essentially divested of a past and then live that way until that past literally came knocking at their door. Even when they're confronted with their pasts, most accused immigrant perpetrators insisted not that they didn't do it, but that they didn't want to do it. Or even stranger, that what they did was so long ago that it's not really worth all the fuss anymore and kind of should just be let go. These behaviors suggest that immigrant perpetrators truly believed that their perpetration should not encumber them and that they should be granted the unique opportunity to move on, an opportunity that their victims certainly did not have access to. It's like they truly feel that immigration should have given them a blank slate and allowed them to disappear into boringness, and to assert otherwise is an affront. Where the imagined Nazi in America is frozen forever in the moment of perpetration, the real ones were able to insist that the moment of perpetration was actually immaterial to themselves outside of it. And I think that is what should fascinate us and why these more boring stories are worth telling and worth paying attention to. And they definitely fascinate me. But America as a whole prefers stories about Nazis that allow us to indulge in the fantasies that I've been talking about, because those fantasies help us to sustain a national mythos in which we are always heroes vanquishing evil, and in which the only place that evil flourishes is in the shadows or in the sciences or in the high school janitor's closet. Just to wrap this up, I think the primary problem with these sort of fantasized versions of immigrant perpetrators in America is not solely inaccuracy, but it's instead their contribution to historical flattening. The continuous repetition of a single archetypal character in one of only a small handful of contexts with only very few goals and very few potential narrative outcomes has effectively superseded historical reality. The real lives of perpetrators also challenge narratives fundamental to American culture, namely that justice is easily achievable via the American legal system, which is obviously not true, especially now, but is certainly part of our national mythology. Um, and also that the Holocaust holds a sacred place in American memory, and we've always cared about it, which is also not true, but is a deeply held public and popular belief nonetheless. And also, the belief that if we discovered a perpetrator in our midst, we simply wouldn't stand for it. Um, in whole, neither the real lives of Holocaust perpetrators in America nor their endings satisfy our imagination. So we return over and over and over again to stories that we like better, both in fictional representations and in journalistic and historical reporting. In continuously recycling an archetype that bears little resemblance to reality, real immigrant Holocaust perpetrators are, however unintentionally, having their requests for obscurity essentially granted. In this way, I think perpetrators in America can really be seen as microcosms of the broader problem of American Holocaust memory. Essentially, we're obsessed with it and we're wrong about it. And perhaps we're wrong about it because we're obsessed with it. We too often allow our understandings of the Holocaust and its perpetrators to be dictated by whatever we wish it was and whoever we wish they were, for the sake of narrative convenience, often to the detriment of creating a public understanding that is based in fact. I'm going to leave it there because I know I've been talking for a really long time. Uh, I'm really excited to hear the questions that you have. Thank you again for listening. Um, and yeah, I'm happy to hear your thoughts on this.
Well, Claire, first of all, thank you so much for your presentation. I want to say that I'm looking forward to your book. I mean, not in the way that one anticipates a treat, but rather for the information that I know it will provide. This was very interesting. And for all of you listening, I do hope that you will please put your questions in the Q&A box included in this event. But because I'm the moderator, I get the chance to ask the first question, and I'm of course fascinated by this idea of the imaginary Nazi, which I think you outlined so well. And I'm going to ask you to speculate. I want you to step away from the research for a moment. If Nazis are imaginary and we have this archetype in our mind, then they can be compared to anything. Anyone can be, anyone's motives can be Nazi-like. Do you think that this idea, this mythic idea of the Nazi as the ultimate enemy, is one of the things that has contributed to, as you said, the over-verbalization, perhaps, or reference to Nazism, even though we don't understand?
Yeah, and I think you're right to identify that as a big part of this problem, actually, because we have started to use them as like this ultimate avatar for evil, in that like not to sort of say, well, what about everyone else? But there are other groups of people who have done lots of very, very bad things. And it's useful to draw bits and pieces from several places in order to construct a real historical framework and framework for understanding. Uh, and so sometimes people will say, well, they're just like the Nazis. And there actually might be a better analogy to be made with someone else that we can learn from or draw pieces from. Uh, but the Nazi is easier. Like it's an easier option because we've had this imagined version of a person. It has filtered through society and public narrative so thoroughly that like this feels like the easiest metaphor to reach for. And I think that's to our detriment, in part because it cheapens it a little bit. It cheapens this thing and actually makes it harder for us to understand Nazis. If we say everyone is a Nazi, it makes it a little bit harder. There are moments when it's appropriate, certainly, and I'm very open. I think compared to some other people within the field, I'm very open to using analogy to help us understand like things like issues in the present moment. Uh, but I think that we should be using them in conjunction with other things rather than like defaulting to this singular imagined person, basically.
Thank you for that. And actually, I want to take now a question from our audience, someone who compliments you on a fascinating presentation and asks, can you trace an evolution in the way that these Nazis on American soil are represented? How have these books and films changed and why?
One of the big things, and this sounds really simple, but is aging. So when we first, where I would locate the first major example of this is 1946. So this, when I said earlier in the talk that this happens almost immediately after the end of the Holocaust, it really is immediate. The first major film on this is 1946. It's The Stranger by Orson Welles. And there's like a Nazi who's living in the US. They show concentration camp footage in the film. He dies. He's like thrown off a clock tower. It's very dramatic. Um, and he's young in this. Part of it is that he's young and he's married someone in this town, also in Connecticut, this fictional Connecticut town. Uh, and he is young and like handsome and attractive and has like seduced someone basically. And this starts like they age up over time and the age becomes a big factor later where it's sort of like, but he's old. What do we do about the fact that they're old now? Which is part of the problem also, I think, in this justice seeking scenario. But yeah, we can locate it from as soon as the end of the Holocaust, basically. And other than that, what I think is very interesting is most of the narrative framework around it does not change, actually, just the age changes. It's the same iteration and reiteration of an idea over and over and over again because we're so obsessed with this one single idea. Um, I haven't thought about it in terms of evolution until now, but I think that is very interesting because there's not that much of an evolution, which I think proves the point that I'm trying to make, actually.
Great question, then. I'm glad you were able to answer that. I'm reminded when you talk about age, there is an Israeli movie, I cannot remember the title, with the actor Lior Ashkenazi, who's confronted with the fact that the final revenge that could be taken upon a Nazi is when he's very old and helpless. And what
Mm.
does that mean for revenge? So fascinating. That obviously transcends American boundaries. But with that, let me go to another question from Gary. Is the fictional Nazi villain in America a history of the past or a warning against the future? And here.
That's a great question. Um, I think a lot of it is a renegotiation of the Holocaust. So I think it's kind of both and neither a little bit. So sometimes they're reimagining something that didn't happen, and sometimes they're saying, well, this is what we could do. But a lot of times it's a way of trying to renegotiate America's ability to cope with the Holocaust and understanding of the Holocaust. It's a way to sort of like get narrative revenge on someone and pretend that we're all heroes who all do these engage in vigilante justice or whatever, and that we care deeply about the Holocaust beyond just as space in our fantasies and in our imagination that we care in this like very proactive way. So we're renegotiating our understanding of the past a lot. Um, but what is strange is a lot of these films are not forward looking. Like a lot of them are not actually making an argument about the future. They're just sort of like a what we wish had happened thing. And then it's the audience's choice about whether they want to imagine a better future out of it. What's interesting is in Holocaust films that are not about perpetrators and perpetration, a lot of them are very clear warnings about the future. Like a lot of them have a very obvious intended message. And I don't think these have that obvious of a message. They often instead are like, let's nostalgically reimagine this thing we could have done or could do. Um, but it's always a thing we could do to these specific bad guys rather than to all people who engage in war crimes or commit genocide, etc. Um, so not a super satisfying answer. But yeah, it is that they occupy this very weird space, I think.
Thank you for that. Let me back away from the imaginary Nazi for a moment. We have a question from Will, who has a more sort of pragmatic question, I suppose. What was the political vetting process like for those trying to get out of the DP camps to the USA? And how did the Cold War impinge on this?
Well, it's a good thing that my book will have two chapters on this. So it's explicated very thoroughly there, and that will be out later this year. Um, but I can give you a short version. They are vetted pretty thoroughly. And so they occupy kind of a weird space there too, which I'll explain in just a second. They go through several layers of vetting. So they have police checks. They have interviews with their neighbors to see like, are they trustworthy? Are they good? Are they gonna, kick your dog or whatever? And then they have several interviews with the UNRWA, which is the UN Refugee Relief Administration. They have interviews then with the U.S. Army Counterintelligence Corps, the CIC. But as you identified in the question, a lot of it is about politics, and the politics that they are weeding out for the most part. Yeah, if someone is obviously a Nazi, they'll like say that you can't come. But if they played their cards right, if perpetrators play their cards right and say, actually, I'm just extremely anti-Soviet or I'm extremely anti-communist, that is really the main priority in terms of what the US is looking for out of immigrants during the Cold War, is they care more that they're anti-communist and are not going to enter the US and spread communism or socialism in the US. That matters a lot more than like making sure they're not Nazis. And this is also a big reason why most of them are Eastern Europeans rather than Germans, because we don't have access to records, we meaning the US government, which I'm not a part of, but in this context, America doesn't have access to a lot of records that are held on Eastern European perpetrators because they're liberated by the Soviets. The camps and the areas they're working in are liberated by the Soviets, and the Soviets have the records. And then we have the Iron Curtain, which basically prevents us from accessing this information. The US has access to something called the Berlin Document Center, or the BDC, where we can check Nazi party membership, but we don't know about people who are not officially affiliated behind the Iron Curtain. And so like a lot of this is the US not knowing what it doesn't know and having the wrong people on its inimical parties list, and also trusting processes that are messy and being negotiated in real time, and people who are trained, like the vetters for the CIC receive one full day of training before they start vetting, so they don't have the capacity to figure some of these things out. And when they do have the capacity, they kind of ignore it sometimes because they would prefer a strong anti-communist than someone who might be a little bit iffy on the Nazi question. And yeah, so the Cold War has a huge, huge role in this. And it has a very big role later in accusations because uh, until the end of the Cold War, or until the fall of the Soviet Union, when perpetrators are being accused of having been a perpetrator, often they'll say this is falsified Soviet evidence, that this is really what's happening here, that the Soviets are trying to paint me in a certain way because they know I'm a good anti-communist. And sometimes it works. Sometimes it doesn't, but sometimes it does work. So yeah, the Cold War is like this third secret looming thing in the background of all of this.
That is really interesting. The way, you could go from enemy to friend and back again because of the context of the Cold War. So great, thank you for that. We have a participant named James who really, I think his basic question is that just what you said, that Americans are ignorant. Do you have advice? Do you have ideas? What can we do to combat that ignorance and the way it distorts our historical perspective and our contemporary times?
I do think there is. This is a tricky one to navigate, actually, in part because there are lots of amazing organizations that are doing really great work in terms of Holocaust remembrance, and so I think that is excellent, and those people are doing a much better job than I am because that's not what I work on. But I do think there is a level of sensationalism and a level of media overproduction about the Holocaust that allows hyper sensationalized narratives to become popular. Um, so I actually found it very difficult to find when I was doing the research for my dissertation, which is now this book. I found it difficult to find real scholarly research on some of these things. And instead, I was constantly finding like journalists turned historians working on this, but without the methodological background that's necessary to sort of parse out like really critical information. I think films really underscore this. I think they also draw from these hyper sensationalized narratives, and like it's not a good solution because I don't want to tell people to make more boring films or write more boring, books. But I do think we need to question what the motivation behind the things that we're making, the media that we're making about the Holocaust, like where that motivation is coming from. Because often it comes from a place of sort of like Schadenfreude or like justice seeking, later narrative justice. But in order to achieve that, it has to divorce itself from reality, because in reality that's not actually what happened to people. So like I think we need to really question why people and why we are making the media that we're making about this, and who it actually, like what purpose it actually serves.
I think we have time for one more question. Thank you to those of you who submitted, and we weren't able to get to your questions today. I just want to jump back to precursors to your research. Christopher Browning with Ordinary Men, Hannah Arendt probably with Eichmann in Jerusalem. This idea that ordinary people, as you said, ordinary, boring people are able to, perpetrate acts of great violence, horrific and tragic effects on others, and then to go back to their normal lives. Does your research address that as well?
Yeah, I mean, it does because it requires a lot of shifting self-perception and understanding the sort of mutability of the human personality and of the human memory. Um, I draw a lot from Christopher Browning in my work because I think he is one of the few people who have engaged with perpetrators as people. And he talks a lot, and I talk a lot about the idea of empathy as like a necessary lens through which to understand perpetration, not as in forgiving and understanding, but as in knowledge that a person is a person and behaves like a person, even when committing grave, grave injustices. Um, and so I think that it's it's necessary to sort of understand this like plasticity in a person's ability to see themselves, because if you do something very, very bad and you live your whole life feeling bad, like it's hard to live or function. And we have many cases of these perpetrators who struggle to function. Actually, they live these normal lives, but they're still like negotiating this issue forever, and with their self-perception. We have reports, for example, of one perpetrator who was in his 90s, and his neighbor would see him crying on his back porch every single day, and she suspected it had to do with this. So there is something where they might be outwardly behaving normally, but they are like processing this for a very long time, and they can't talk about it with anyone, because then of course they will be, they think this isn't what actually happens, but they think they'll be deported. And like, I think that's a very interesting thing to be like thinking our way into, to sort of understand, not like we need to have more empathy or sympathy for perpetrators, but we need to understand that they are humans and they have this, like, they have to cope somehow, right? Like they have to move somewhere, or, and for a lot of them, they're like, well, if I leave Europe, I can just leave this thing that I did behind and I don't have to think about it anymore. But then it shows up in things like nightmares. We have lots of cases of them having lifelong nightmares after this. We have very obvious, what we would call sort of PTSD symptoms. So um, it's a really interesting, difficult thing, and it requires like looking at them outside of this lens of like this inescapable evil, and instead looking at them as human beings who do really terrible, awful things. And then that helps us to understand how we can counteract it later, right? Like by saying, well, we have to counteract this on a human level to prevent it in the future, basically.
I think that's a great, somewhat hopeful place to wrap up, perhaps. I want to thank you so much, Claire, for being with us. And for those of you who are listening, thank you for joining us. Please do sign up for YPSA's listserv. You will get notifications of our future events, and we always have something great planned. So thank you, everyone, and we'll see you at the next event.
Thank you.